Bueno, egunon guztioi eta ongi etorri arrazakeria eta osasun arreta jardunaldira. Bueno, lehenik eta behin oso pozoi gaudela, jardunaldi honek sortu duen interesarekin. Egia esateko ez genuen espero, hainbeste jende izena ematea, eta bueno, bai presentziala eta bai online. Espero dugu gaurko eguna oso interesgarria eta aberasgarria izatea guztiontzat. Decía que buenos días a todas y a todos y que bienvenidos a esta jornada de racismo y atención sanitaria. Que estamos muy contentas del interés que ha despertado y del reflejo que ha tenido en la inscripción, tanto de forma presencial como online. En primer lugar, quería empezar agradeciendo a todas las personas que han colaborado activamente tanto en pensar el programa y el contenido, digamos, de la jornada, como en los aspectos logísticos, que son imprescindibles para que las cosas funcionen. En este sentido, agradecer a Médicos del Mundo Euskadi y especialmente a Xavi Aguirre y a Asti Gil también su predisposición, ¿no?, para, bueno, a lo largo del proyecto en el que se marca esta jornada y en la propia jornada. Y también, por supuesto, a todas las compañeras de OPIC, que siempre están ahí ayudando y apoyando, y en esta ocasión especialmente a la sección enfermera de OPIC, que bueno, pues han pensado junto conmigo mucho todo lo que tiene que ver con la jornada y han traído a un público excepcional también. También agradecer a todas las personas que habéis aceptado participar como ponentes, bueno, por lo fácil que lo habéis puesto todo y bueno, me alegra que podamos haber creado este pequeño espacio de encuentro y que sirva sobre todo como espacio de reflexión para ver cómo abordamos, ¿no?, esto del racismo en la salud y en el sistema sanitario aquí en nuestro contexto, ¿no? Dos avisos solo antes de darle la palabra a Pedro Gullón, que es quien realmente va a inaugurar la jornada. En primer lugar, para quienes estáis online, el canal de comunicación para poder hacer preguntas o comentarios a los ponentes y en las mesas es el email de OPIC, que tenéis aquí en la pantalla, opic@ehu.eus. Es el mismo email desde donde os enviamos el enlace para conectaros, entonces podéis responder ahí mismo. También si tenéis cualquier problema de conexión o no se oye bien o algo, por favor comunicárnoslo a través del email. Vale, y en cuanto a la estructura, vamos a hacer seguidas las primeras presentaciones hasta las 11, que haremos una pausa. Las que tengáis dispositivo de traducción aquí en la sala, por favor, a la salida a las 11 devolvedlo, ¿vale?, porque ya el resto de la jornada va a ser en castellano. Y después, para quienes estáis online y queráis utilizar la traducción simultánea de castellano a inglés para la primera ponencia de Stephanie, tenéis que cambiar al canal 2, que también os enviamos en el email el enlace, pero el resto de la jornada se va a desarrollar en el canal 1, ¿vale? Entonces, únicamente el canal 2 para quienes quieran escuchar la traducción simultánea y si no, se pueden quedar en el 1 escuchando en inglés. Y ya está. Ahora me toca presentar a Pedro Gullón. Él es médico especialista en medicina preventiva y salud pública, profesor e investigador de la Universidad de Alcalá y ahora actualmente desarrollando el cargo de director general de salud pública y equidad en salud, en el Ministerio de Sanidad. Y además es amigo. Así que estoy muy contenta de que él esté aquí inaugurando la jornada y nada, ya le doy la palabra para que lo haga.
Egunon, buenos días a todas y todos. Muchas gracias, Yolanda, por siempre por la labor que haces y hacéis y también por invitarme a esta jornada. Pequeño inciso, como un pequeño chascarrillo. Yolanda, cuando me mandó el programa, dije, ojo, Yolanda, yo quiero ir. Dice, pero claro, para que me dejen salir tengo que hacer algo. Digo, ¿me pones a inaugurar? Y me dice, sí, claro, voy a inaugurar para que al menos te dejen salir. Y es que, claro, yo creo que en la situación en la que estoy ahora, como en el cargo en el que ostento ahora, es muy importante que mostremos cuáles son las prioridades políticas que tenemos. Muchas veces no es ni siquiera todo lo que hacemos, sino también cómo mostramos y a qué damos prioridad a la hora de hablar. Entonces creo que ya está marcando del momento en el que podemos hacer acciones que directamente pues me ha venido aquí para inaugurar, pero sobre todo a poder escuchar toda la jornada y poder estar aquí, aprender, tomar notas, ver cómo podemos ir adelante, aprender un poco de esa construcción que ha hecho Yolanda de este espacio de reflexión. Así que muchas gracias, Yolanda, por invitarme, y gracias en general a OPIC, o sea, todo ese grupo de investigación en el que todos querríamos estar. Y muchas gracias a médicos del mundo también por hacer la labor para esta jornada. Es como complicado empezar así a hablar, pero eh, las políticas que hacemos son racistas. El sistema sanitario que tenemos es racista y tenemos una sociedad racista. Básicamente porque el racismo existe y permea de diferentes formas. No es una serie de culpas individuales a las personas en las que estamos, sino que hay un sistema que nos empuja a que seamos racistas en general. Y eso termina, como decía, permeando en las políticas que hacemos, en el propio sistema sanitario y cómo tratamos a las personas y hacemos exclusión de ellas, que de hecho la conferencia después trata mucho sobre esa discriminación hacia personas racializadas, y esto no es más que un reflejo de cómo es la sociedad en general. Y es importante que hagamos un marco grande de esto para dos cosas. La primera, porque nos permite ver que esto es un poco más grande y que tenemos que actuar de forma global. De salud pública muchas veces decimos que para atajar los problemas de salud pública tenemos que hablar de salud en todas las políticas e intentar que todas las políticas tengan un enfoque de salud. Desde luego, para intentar que el racismo no sea lo que es ahora, necesitamos un antirracismo en todas las políticas. Con lo cual, no es una cuestión de lo que hagamos aquí, vamos a reflexionar mucho lo que hacemos dentro del sistema sanitario, pero que también tenemos que tener siempre la mirada puesta afuera. Esto en unos tiempos que son difíciles. O sea, no vamos a negarlo. Ayer ya estuvimos comentando algunas cosas y charlando. Claro, hablamos que en general pues hay un retroceso en las ideas comunes que habíamos estado construyendo respecto a solidaridad, antirracismo, sin desde luego desmerecer todos los cambios positivos que estamos teniendo, pero especialmente en los últimos años, con el auge de determinados discursos, se está convirtiendo en más difícil. Cómo esto permea, cómo vuelve a crecer la idea específicamente en migración, pero que la migración es un problema per se que hay que solucionar, no una circunstancia que tenemos que abordar con derechos humanos, sino como un problema social. Todas estas ideas que están permeando, desde luego, no nos dan el mejor esquema posible. Pero claro, yo tengo que ser optimista porque no me queda otra. O sea, porque si no, ¿qué hago en política? ¿No? O sea, ¿o qué hago en este cargo? Si no soy optimista y no creo que se puedan cambiar las cosas, pues ¿qué hago? Si estamos aquí es porque creemos que las políticas que decía antes pueden no ser racistas y mejor pueden ser antirracistas. Porque creemos que el sistema sanitario no debe incrementar las desigualdades de raza, sino que incluso puede no aumentarlas e incluso disminuirlas. Y lo mismo, y porque podemos tener una sociedad antirracista. Por eso soy optimista, porque todos esos elementos que he dicho antes no son naturales. Son elementos que hemos construido socialmente y por lo tanto podemos deconstruirlos y construir nuevos socialmente. Yo diría que tenemos como tres principales vías de acción sobre las que creo que podemos manejar el futuro, y creo que muchas de las conversaciones de hoy van a versar sobre ello. La primera es una acción normativa, y la pongo delante porque me dedico también a escribir normas. La primera es normativa. Dentro del sistema sanitario, evidentemente, tenemos una muy básica, muy básica, muy básica, que lleva años para no salir, que es una ley de universalidad para expandir de verdad el sistema sanitario hacia lo más universal. Y esto es urgente, ya desde el Real Decreto Ley 16/2012, que muchas de aquí sois tan jóvenes que nos acordáis de la polémica que surgió respecto a ese Real Decreto que excluía a personas que no tenían papeles, hasta la situación de ahora. Creo que es necesario que de verdad apostemos por un sistema sanitario verdaderamente universal, porque es la idea y es lo que nos sentimos orgullosos de nuestro sistema sanitario, que atendamos en base a lo que tenemos delante, es decir, a personas. no respecto a su origen o respecto al racismo que le queramos pedir más o menos burocracia simplemente por puro racismo. Pero esto no es todo lo que vale, y hoy vamos a profundizar un poco así, no nos vamos a quedar esos eslóganes, es lo bonito de este espacio de reflexión. Una ley nos va a venir muy bien y desde luego es un paso adelante muy importante, pero el racismo permea en las relaciones del día a día, las relaciones que tenemos en consulta. Y por ello es muy importante una segunda línea de acción que sea el trabajo con profesionales, el trabajo que ya se realiza desde una perspectiva crítica en diferentes movimientos. A Marta, por ejemplo, de Yo sí, Sanidad Universal, o el trabajo que hace también, veo aquí a Nacho, de Salud entre Culturas, el trabajo que se hace con los propios profesionales también para intentar que esto no se incremente en el sistema sanitario. Y además este es un trabajo a largo plazo, no hay que entrar en maniqueísmos, porque esto no es hay que educar a los profesionales de la salud. Evidentemente que hay que formar, pero no podemos ser tan naif para pensar que simplemente educando a la gente se produce un cambio social de este calado, ¿no? Y más en una educación centrada en profesionales de la salud, que son personas con un alto nivel educativo y que además, bueno, pues también se ven afectados por las dinámicas sociales que hay, ¿no? Entonces no solo es un tema de educación, es un trabajo de trabajo con los profesionales para intentar cambiar las dinámicas en las que ocurre ese racismo en el sistema sanitario. Y luego la tercera línea de acción, que sobrepasa el sistema sanitario, es en trabajar en una sociedad antirracista. Y por eso es tan importante la parte de esta jornada donde tenemos colectivos antirracistas que también van a ofrecer su visión de lo que existe en el antirracismo, cómo se aplica al sistema sanitario, pero también para avanzar en una sociedad antirracista. Y creo que el sistema sanitario o la atención sanitaria, debido a su propia base, que lo que queremos básicamente es que la gente sea más, no tenemos un objetivo mayor que no sea que es que la máxima gente posible tenga el mejor nivel de salud posible. Que bajo esa perspectiva, ¿cómo no vamos a ser antirracistas? ¿Cómo no vamos a ser la punta de lanza para intentar que los otros sectores sociales se sumen a los derechos humanos, que se sumen a la necesidad de tratar a todas las personas por igual e intentar disminuir estos elementos más estructurales? Creo que tenemos oportunidad de avanzar en estos aspectos en la jornada de hoy. Yo, desde luego, estoy muy contento con el programa que habéis elaborado y nada, pues con muchas ganas de construir, con muchas ganas de escuchar y con muchas ganas de toda la jornada. Así que doy por inauguradas estas jornadas. Muchas gracias, eskerrik asko.
Eskerrik asko, Pedro. Bueno, vamos a pasar ya a la ponencia inaugural de la jornada. Es para mí un honor presentaros a Stephanie Hatch. Ella es vicedecana de Cultura, Diversidad e Inclusión y profesora de Sociología y Epidemiología en el Instituto de Psiquiatría, Psicología y Neurociencia del King's College de Londres. Lidera el grupo de investigación en desigualdades en salud y este grupo y ella se centran en investigar las desigualdades en salud mental en comunidades vulnerabilizadas, con especial énfasis en la raza y en su intersección con otras identidades sociales o ejes de desigualdad. Ella misma también comentará algo más relacionado con quién es y con de dónde viene, así que le doy ya la palabra para que pueda hacer su ponencia. Eskerrik asko, y I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you for coming, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I just want to thank the organizers for having me, and it's such a privilege to be able to come and speak about our work on what is a global problem. I like to start every presentation with just stating my positionality. Those of you may recognize that I have an American accent. So I grew up in the southern part of the United States. I'm the daughter of a retired nurse, which sort of inspired a lot of the work that I went on to develop that I'll talk about today. My mother, women in my family, also nurses, were either nurses or teachers, faced a lot of racism. And when I left the US 20 years ago and migrated to the UK, it became very apparent to me through the work that I started to do, focused on inequities in health services, that there were nurses and midwives and doctors and other professionals from racial and ethnic minoritized groups that were facing some of the same challenges. So I took that on, and when I took it on, it was a very uncomfortable topic for a lot of people to hear. And I was really grateful that the introduction today was so direct. This is a global issue. It's a global issue that has, a long-standing history. And it's one that people often shy away from, and I'm going to talk about the impact that has. So we can all address this together, and my research group, our Health Inequalities Research Group, we also have a Health and Social Equity Collective, where we work across sectors and really take systems approach to addressing equity. Very important for us because we can't just tackle it in one sector. This is something that, impacts. So if you think about us sitting here today in a university, educating people, many of you go on, you study medicine, you get, involved in the health services. So right there, we've already crossed two sectors. So it's really about that whole, pathway, how we come to address that. So my group has an ethos. We focus on, equity, on reciprocity and sustainability. We focus on developing a more inclusive evidence base. That's really important because a lot of what we know is not based on, being inclusive of the global majority, which we are, right? And it's really about, building that evidence base and out of that evidence base, having actionable insights. So I do a lot of advisory work with policy, NHS England, and the government, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. One of the things that I'm particularly proud of that's happened in the UK is that we have an NHS Race and Health Observatory. And as a board member, very proud to be a part of this organization, because what it's done is it's focused our attention on being able to summarize and get really clear on what some of the problems are, and that this is a life course issue. So you can see from this infographic, just right across health, there's probably no area of health in the UK that is untouched by racism and discrimination, and we see it in these persistent inequities in these various health areas, and quite stark. But we cannot talk about this unless we take a step back and think about the overarching systems of oppression that are really guiding, the ways in which we have been socialized. So yes, you are a part of a society that is racialized, and racism exists, and it's come to impact how you, think, how you learn, how you engage with other people. And it's not just about racism, it's, thinking about other, what we call in the UK, protected characteristics. I've just focused on a few here today, but it's really to illustrate the intersectionality. So yes, I'm going to emphasize racism today, but it doesn't mean that it discounts any of these other areas, because we are not sort of occupying just one identity and feeling one system of oppression. Oftentimes what we're doing is experiencing the cumulative effect of these systems of oppression. So this is a picture from one of the recent protests in the UK. You may have heard we had some race riots last summer. And these things do bubble to the surface, and it does help to focus the mind. Now, in the introduction, there was a clear, direct ask about us getting really clear on how we go about, thinking about confronting institutional racism in particular. How do we think about anti-racism approaches? And I challenge people to really think about what they mean by anti-racism, because like intersectionality, it's becoming one of those, overused, under-defined terms. So I'm going to offer today what I have been, thinking about and what my group has been thinking about and developing. So we've been working in partnership with Dr. Kamara Jones from the US, who puts forward some very simple ways in which we can think about this, has a framework, which I've outlined here in just these 3 simple bubbles. So, the first thing is about naming racism, which we've already started today doing. And the reason why that's important is because there's so much racism denial. How many times have you heard someone say, yeah, but is that really racism? Yeah, but is that really, like, how can you prove it? I had a very senior leader just last week ask me, well, how do you prove that there's institutional racism within our mental health services? And I looked back at him, I said, the onus is not on me. Given the history of this country, given the history of racism globally, the onus is on you to tell me how these institutions are not racist, right? Because this is where we've gotten to. So naming racism is your first step. The second is to really try and understand, how is racism operating here? And I'll come on to how you might go about doing that. And then you're already doing partly the third step, which is to collectively organize and to strategize, to act. And we're talking about everything from very small things to the bigger issues about changing policies, all very important. So I've been using the word, but I want to give you just one of many definitions of racism, just so that we're on the same page as I finish my talk. So what we're talking about here is a system, right? It's structuring opportunity. It's assigning value based on these socially constructed phenotypes, right? So skin color and hair texture and all of those things. These are things that, I travel around the world, and as a light-skinned Black woman, sometimes I go to Brazil, I might be called white, right? Because I'm the lightest person in the room. I go to other areas, and in the US, growing up in the South, we have a 1-drop rule. So 1 drop and I'm Black. There is no in between. I go to the UK, I'm constantly in a struggle with the NHS, because every time I go to a visit, the administrator wants to check a mixed race box. I've got 2 Black parents and 4 Black grandparents. You can work out through the history why you have the admixture, which has made me the shade of of Black that I am, but I identify as Black. And so it's really pointing out that social construction. And simply put, racism unfairly disadvantages some groups, it unfairly advantages other groups, and it saps our society of its resources. Right? So imagine all we're missing out on because we've chosen to discount different groups of people because of something like the color of their skin. It seems absolutely ridiculous. But this is what we're doing. This is what endures. And we also need to think about the process through which this happens, right? So we focus on racialization, not just on racism as a system, but thinking about that process of othering. So I was in the US as a minoritized person. I came to the UK as a minoritized person. I had a whole life course of developing, I came to the UK as an adult. I had a whole lifetime of developing coping strategies to deal with racism and discrimination. Now, counter that to someone who has come from a country in which they're in the majority and they have migrated and become othered. So as an adult, imagine all of a sudden having to think about that. And I'll never forget one of the quotes from a qualitative interview that we did from a woman who we broadly identified as Black African, which is ridiculous, but there you go, because we're talking about so many different countries. But she said, I never had to think, she's 40 years old when she migrated to the UK. And she said, I never had to think about being Black before. So all of a sudden it's about, you think about all, whereas in contrast for me, since I was a very small child, I was socialized. There's that racial socialization that happens. I was socialized to navigate majority white environments, to navigate for my own safety, different areas, where I could go, where I couldn't go, what would happen, and going into school. So it's got this life course narrative where many of us were exposed to racism and discrimination from a very young age. From the very point that you're going into any institution, which is, of course, school, your primary school. That's for many, the first time that they're confronting this. And it shapes, it's shaped by the social context. It limits your life chances. So thinking about, not just, we're talking about health services today, but think about that whole sort of life course trajectory in which people are coming into services sometimes, having experienced, again, this sort of cumulative exposure unnecessarily. And my group doesn't just look at experiencing discrimination as one of the mechanisms. We also look at witnessing discrimination and anticipating discrimination. So by that, I mean avoiding going for certain opportunities because you've never seen anyone who looks like you succeed in those areas. And one of the things that was important from the community work that we did, and from just the literature that's available globally, we know that discrimination in particular, as an act of and a mechanism for racism to persist, has a pervasive impact on health. Mental health, physical health, most likely, the strongest associations we see with mental health, and impacts health services as well. And what's startling to people was what we showed about both anticipating discrimination, also impacting your mental health, but also witnessing. So this is everyone's problem. Whether or not you are directly impacted by this is neither here nor there, because we've shown that as actually, especially in the workplace, increasing your likelihood of experiencing anxiety and other issues with your health, because it's creating a toxic environment. So one of the things that we talk about is culture, and we've heard about that, and that is the thing that we have to ultimately try and shift. And you will have heard, about culturally adapting services and cultural competency. That's a big one. Cultural humility, I think, is where we need to start. And that's about everyone in this room owning the privilege or the advantages and disadvantages that you may face, but really coming to terms with that. And it's something that my group does as a practice. So we engage in reflective practice as a part of our work to think about what our positionality, our equitable ways of working, but also our biases that we bring to the work. But the one that I want to focus on is cultural safety, because I think that's where we start to make progress a lot, in this area. And I love that it's social justice focused, and that it was co-developed by a nurse, a Māori nurse in New Zealand, to really focus on these issues, on these structural issues, on the power imbalances that we see within health services, and around this cultural dominance, and what does this actually mean? Why are we hanging on to it? The other piece of theory that I try to tap into is around identifying racialized organizations and in what ways they can be identified. So really looking at, whether or not an organization is enhancing or diminishing certain racialized groups. I won't go through the whole thing, but just to give you some examples. The one here around treating whiteness as a credential. This is, for example, came out really clearly in our work around student nurses. And I'll talk about the study in a little bit more detail in a minute. But one of the key findings that shocked people, because we didn't just interview those, so these were qualitative interviews. We didn't just interview those that were from racialized groups. We also interviewed those from the white British group. And it was very clear, you know, they were talking about their whiteness as a credential and what that got them in their workplace, in those spaces. So our overarching question is really around who cares for those who care. And today I'm talking about those in health services who are, you know, in paid care, but we also in our group focus on informal, what we call unpaid carers and formal carers, because they often are invisible and often get left out, but there's also that overlap. So here I'm talking about caring for a loved one, caring for, you know, being a caregiver on a daily basis. So there are many who work in this field, as you will know, that also have other caring responsibilities. Now, within the NHS, some people are surprised to hear it is the largest employer of those from racial and ethnic minoritized groups in the UK. And we have over 200 nationalities represented. So we're talking about a very diverse health service. With a long history of depending on internationally trained doctors and nurses to come into the NHS and fill gaps and to fill shortages. So this is just a picture of members of my team. I always like to, these are team members who contributed to the work that I'm going to talk about today. The team has expanded since then, but also included in this picture are nurses who work within the NHS who came aboard, you know, came on board with our team to be trained up and work alongside us. So we use a lot of participatory action processes that I'll talk about. But TIDES, the study has two phases. We started off focusing on London, so looking at discrimination experienced by both patients and by healthcare practitioners to try and understand how you know, discrimination was generating and perpetuating these inequities that we were seeing. And the reason why we focused on London is because we have in the NHS a workforce race equality standard. So it basically scores and looks into different metrics that help us to understand what's being experienced at the trust level. So a trust will, you know, include a hospital and sort of be across a very large geographical area. So to give you an example, the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, which my university is associated with, covers about 1.2 million people within just in, you know, 4 boroughs in Southeast London. Now, one of the things about this workforce race equality standard is they take evidence and data from an annual staff survey. So there's an annual NHS staff survey. They use those metrics to identify some of the core problems. And what we did is we took some of those items and repeated them, and I'll show you the findings in a minute. But what was important is that we were outsiders to the system. So there was a lot more, we sort of took our cues from that, and what we were looking for were the areas in which we saw the worst outcomes, and that was in London at the time, which was surprising to us because it is the most ethnically and racially diverse part of the UK. And then the second phase of TIDES came through COVID. Right, so in response, so it was an emergency funds that we were awarded from our UKRI to look at the impact that COVID-19 was having on these inequalities. So my group uses mixed methods. We use both qualitative and quantitative methods. So with our quantitative work, we design our own surveys, but we also analyze electronic health anonymized electronic health records that also have a series of data linkages from everything from hospital statistics to mortality. And then we follow up. So if we run a survey, we will then follow up some of those participants to do qualitative in-depth interviews with them. And then, like I said earlier, we're really about more translational approaches. So we have been exploring the use of virtual reality. In TIDES Phase 1, that came in the form of assessing bias in clinical decision-making, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. And then in Phase 2, through our national studies, so for the COVID-related work, we covered all of England. And we're able to co-produce an inequalities module for a very large survey, one of the largest surveys on the workforce during that time, do some qualitative interviews with some of those participants. And then one of the things that we heard from our national stakeholder opinion group, which is made up of healthcare professionals, is that they wanted to stop being the one that had to go into these meetings and tell their story again and again and again. So what we did is we got together with our collaborators who developed the virtual reality and came up with this walking in the shoes of, which allows you to have the experience of experiencing discrimination, either experiencing it firsthand or witnessing it. So that, you know, those around you, colleagues, the racism deniers, your managers, leaders can actually be in the first person in those immersive experiences. And those are through 360-degree film. And so I talked about our process. And so I just want to pause for a second and just give you a sense of what that means. You know, bringing on, you know, healthcare professionals to be peer researchers with us. Having this iterative process. So none of, you know, no question that we ever ask is something that we've just, you know, drawn from solely from the literature or come up from, you know, other information. These are things that we're constantly getting input on so that we know that it's relevant to healthcare professionals in a meaningful way. And then that process just continues on. Because we don't see ourselves as the experts. We see the people with lived experience as the experts. And so one of the things we had to develop, right? So if you're doing research at this level, you really need to make sure that people are trained up, that you're speaking the same language. So what we developed was this online, freely available research and ethics methods course. So it's a 10-week course that any one of you could go on. You know, it's freely available on this Future Learn platform, and allows people to, what we wanted to do, which is to pull the curtain back on research methods and on research, to build more trust in terms of research. Because to be quite frank, every time we go out, people are tired of being research. They don't want it. They want to hear any more about the research. So we try and show them what it is that we do and what it is that we do with their data to make it more accessible. So in TIDES, one of the first papers that came out was just around trying to understand the nature of discrimination. And one of the great things that it allowed us to do was to hone in on the groups that were most affected. So these were women on the one hand, those from Black ethnic groups, but also, and migrants, but also focused us in on the professional group that was most impacted, and those were nurses. So it allowed us to sort of think about, you know, then where do you take that? And it was also helped us to understand that the discrimination co-occurred quite frequently with bullying and harassment. And one of the ways we ask about this, we used, Professor David Williams at Harvard has a measure of discrimination, of major discrimination. And what we like about it is that it asks the question about unfair treatment and then allows the person to tell you what the perceived reason for that unfair treatment is. And I don't really need to explain this slide. You can see the pattern. So I didn't even have to change the slide from our community study to our study with healthcare professionals. We had the same findings. So you can see how salient race is, race and ethnicity are in the experiences of discrimination. And what it leads to, what the workforce race equality standard was not able to provide, was the impact that this has on people. So we were able to show NHS leaders that by exposing your staff to these, unnecessarily exposing them to these tractable problems, you're leading them to poor health, especially mental health, long periods of sickness absence, underrepresentation in senior roles. So we see the discrimination in terms of the career progression. They are more likely to face disciplinary action, which we've been using the virtual reality and especially the eye tracking data. I'll explain, hopefully have some time to explain that later. But really powerful stuff about how teams, healthcare professional teams work. Even when you think that you're not sort of contributing to the problem, we're starting to show these various elements of it. And then the big one is the poor staff retention. So we've got shortages across the board, and I think that's also a global problem. People are just leaving. People just give up. We watch student nurses be so excited to come into the health service, interview them 2 years later, and they're like, enough, I've had enough. And it's usually down to the discrimination and the bullying and harassment. And so one of the qualitative articles that we published was just about this, about people sort of unpacking some of what's driving this. And one of the things that surprised us was this second bullet point. So in London, we've got high diversity, but when you couple that with low inclusion, that's where you start to have the problems. That's what starts to sort of create the exclusion dynamic within teams. And so also thinking about the other intersecting factors. So this is a very complex problem to address. And again, really creating these sort of in-group ideas of working, or just leaving the team or leaving the NHS. And then I've talked about the student nurses. I'm particularly proud of this one because it was one of our master students who led this and got it into quite a good journal. And it's a really important piece because it focuses, again, on those students and how their experiences quickly change. So it is about, putting the anti-racism practices within the training, within the curriculum, addressing that, but then carrying that all the way through. Because a lot of the nurses reported having, on their clinical placements, having these really negative experiences, not just around the color of their skin, but also religion, came up quite strongly. And really thinking about, not seeing those role models. When I became a professor in the UK, I was one of 25 Black women in the entire country to be a professor. And so I carry this, need to be that role model, to have that representation. We're fortunate that the numbers are increasing, but you can imagine, and they were pointing to the same thing, when you don't see someone that looks like you in a senior position, it does have an impact. And then more recently, so this is the COVID-related work. It's, was really important to us, and this co-production, again, came back to this. So everything we asked, these are the topics that we covered in the survey. These were all generated by the healthcare professionals themselves. So they participated in a consensus exercise with us. We did workshops together. We spent hours and hours trying to hone, down, what it was that was particularly, happening to them. And some of the things that we're focused on that were important, that were not coming out in the news and all of that, we had time and time again people telling us, both white and racially minoritized staff, that during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, and especially with people, healthcare professionals dying at disproportionate rates, we had whole teams where all of the white members of staff were working at home and all of those from racial and ethnic minoritized groups were in the hospitals. And we only knew that because we were engaging in this way. And so we asked questions around these issues. And I'm just going to, this is just to show some of the associations that we'd already talked about and the consistency with that. But please do take a look at the paper itself. We not only publish in journals, but we try to disseminate more widely. So my colleague, Rebecca Reed, led on this piece in the conversation, which I think is really powerful. And it's really about, taking the evidence and making sure that it doesn't stay in journals or at presentations and things like that. And then coming on finally to the virtual reality. So thinking about, once you get a handle on what you're thinking you mean by anti-racism, what do you actually do about it? How do you actually act upon it? And so one of the things that we've been doing is piloting this use of virtual reality. So going into trust, into hospitals, and working with teams. So the example I gave earlier around we work, let me just back up a second. We work in collaboration, both with our virtual reality lab in the psychology department that was used to be led by my colleague, Professor Lucia Valmagia, but also the Maudsley Learning Team. And our colleague, Helen Welsh, has done a fantastic job in helping us to understand what's possible in this area. So the first phase focused on bias and clinical decision making, and there we did use the avatars, in part because intersectionality is very difficult to demonstrate in a study, in a research study, right? You'd have to have 100 vignettes to be able to cross all of these identities. But if you use an avatar, it's very easy, very, sort of switching the accent, to establish, a migration status or non-UK born person, or the gender or the race. So it was really about looking at these areas, and the findings, are really showed, and these are also people who had done the survey and qualitative interviews. So we're piecing all of these, triangulating all of these findings together, and some really powerful ways in which that can be used. But we also, what's really taken off is the walking in the shoes of. So this is what moves us beyond your sort of standard training and education around these issues, and allows it to be much more immersive. And really has helped us to engage leaders within the NHS, within the trusts, but more importantly, it has reduced the emotional burden of the groups that are most affected. And it has allowed us to think about where are the barriers. So in the NHS, we found it's not really the heads of the trust, it's not your directors, it's the middle management, it's the ward managers, who are the blockage. So working with them more closely as well, but also engaging policymakers. And so this is just an example. The picture here is the eye tracking data, and I'll tell you the story very quickly. So these are shot in 360-degree VR, and we use qualitative data to generate. So we passed along the anonymized qualitative data to storytellers and screenwriters to create these narratives, and then use live actors. And in this scenario, you have a Black male nurse who is simply asking for PPE. And he's talking to his white managers. And we run that scenario with a team in a headset. After the scenario was run, we asked a series of questions. Overwhelmingly, 90% of the team decided that Tunde was in the wrong, that he was disrespectful, that he needed to be, needed to be disciplined. And so we took that on board. We asked them to, run it again, but we also showed them their eye tracking data. So during that whole scenario, their eyes were only on the Black male nurse. The entire time, they missed the white colleagues being quite aggressive. The manager actually slaps the wall, uses, raises her voice, all of these things, and yet they're just focused on the Black male nurse. So we show it to them again and then have this discussion, and they were quite shocked. But the Black members of the team were like, well, that's my experience. It doesn't matter what happens, and you even hear this from school children, right? It's like no matter what happens, the eyes are on you as the racially minoritized person. And then just the work that we're doing around impacting these health and work outcomes. So it's not just about generating the evidence, but also thinking about what we can do. So I've been working with the Chief Nursing Officer and Chief Midwifery Officer at NHS England to develop resources around combating racism. Also working with our patient and care race equality framework, which is now mandatory throughout all mental health trusts in England. So really working in partnership and trying to not only tackle, thinking, providing the evidence, looking at the policies through an equity lens, but asking the leaders to be more actively racially inclusive. And so this just gives a description, a broad description of what that might look like. And I think the important piece on this page is to really think about not only cultural safety, but psychological safety, as well as providing people with practical examples and tools. Because the feedback I always get is, well, I don't know what to do. I agree with what you're saying. I know this is a problem, but I don't know what the next steps are. So, I really think that's important. And for us, our next steps are broadening this work. So we've just received 7 years of funding from Wellcome to take this collective action. So going back to what I said in the beginning, around taking a systems approach to this, and bringing in social care. So we've got our new award to explore this, to build the VR up and get that, because we've been piloting it in multiple trusts. And now we have other sectors who are interested in using it, like the Metropolitan Police in Manchester, and others. So, and then expanding, like I said earlier, beyond the workforce to also look at unpaid carers. And I want to end with the action piece. So it's really about not only looking at the structural and the systemic, but also addressing the underlying culture. And sometimes that's the hardest bit to tackle. But it's really about going in on what are, challenging those racialized norms. It's really about, understanding this is impacting all staff. And then using a framework that will help you. So again, Dr. Kamara Jones tries to focus us on identifying the levers for change and targets for action. So asking these questions about how is racism operating here? And you can do this in very simple, she just lays out this very simple way to start to do that. Looking at the decision makers and who they are, what they're doing, how they're doing it. And these norms and values that we just take for granted. You join an organization and you just accept, but it's really about challenging those things collectively. And then also thinking about the types of mechanisms. So looking at policies, through an equity lens involves you understanding how they're creating the advantages and disadvantages, how they're limiting self-determination for some. So we talk about a hidden curriculum among the workforce. So the decisions that are made, the opportunities that are given, in the corridor, in one-on-one conversations. So it's really about using these frameworks within your organizations to help to do that. And then I want to push people beyond just identifying the problem and move to the how, right? So, how do these things work? How does racialization impact in your local area? How these things play out, And then that final one is important. So we don't just, it's very important to focus in on the groups most affected, but the flip side of that is to understand how does the advantage group maintain their advantage. So it's what Bruce Link and his colleague talk about is the inequality diversion, right? So we don't pay enough attention to how these systems are actually maintained. How is the advantage maintained? And then I put this slide here because it's just about you committing on a day-to-day basis to act and to engage in a more inclusive way. So it's just a series of questions that we go through in my group and with my colleagues in the health and social care sector, like just as a starting point, to think about like what can we do in our day-to-day practice that would be actually acting on anti-racism and not just talking about it. And finally, just accountability and leadership. I look around, you're either currently a leader or you're a future leader. I want you to I see younger faces in here. Don't discount this slide just because you don't feel like a leader, because you are the future of health care, right? And when people come into my team at a young age, I make them a leader of something because it changes their responsibility in addressing these issues. And so the onus is on us. And there's one piece of it here that is really important, is to constantly monitor and take action on not only resistance to change, but also on collusion. So it's really important for us to start to think about how we become active bystanders, really get in there when you see a problem. So if there's nothing that you understood or remember from what I've said today, just what I want you to do is go back to these 3 points, right? Just remember these 3 things and take them with you today, share them with your colleagues, and act collectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Tenemos tiempo para preguntas y comentarios, lo que os surja, tanto la gente que estáis aquí como no sé si ha llegado algo a través del email, si no, pues empezaremos de todas maneras por lo presencial y así os da tiempo a si alguien quiere comentar algo o preguntar algo a través del email. Aquí está el micrófono. ¿Quién quiera levantar la mano? Sí. ¿Nadie se anima? Amaya, Marta. Ha sido tan impresivo, ¿no? Tan impresionante que nos ha dejado atónitas, ¿no?
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Stephanie. Ha sido súper interesante, como muy inspirador. Yo quería preguntarte sobre la fase digamos, de realidad virtual que utilizasteis para testar cómo ocurren estos sesgos, ¿no?, en la atención y si creéis que fue efectiva, que yo creo que sí, ¿no? Pero quería preguntarte sobre si os planteasteis hacer algún tipo de acercamiento más de tipo observación o etnográfico en la propia hospitales o centros de salud o donde fuera que se hizo, y por qué descartasteis quizás esta opción. y si a nivel ético de comité de ética o alguna cuestión de este tipo tuvisteis problemas al respecto y por eso optasteis por esa otra opción como más indirecta, pero que probablemente igual también fue muy efectiva. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you. So the ethics committee actually had a problem with the observations, the direct observations. So initially, we wanted to go into hospital settings to do those observations, and the ethics committee, and I think because they knew, a lot of the trusts know what their problems are. They see it in the workforce race equality standard, and I think that they are shy about allowing researchers into those spaces. We also tried to approach it in primary care. The ethics committee, because of Lucia Valmalgia's work, she's now gone to Australia, but because of her work and what she's built up with the VR lab, we haven't had really any problems. I think one of the things that we make very clear is because those VR scenarios, including how we developed the VR, are actually done in co-production with healthcare professionals. That's much more welcomed than us sort of deciding what the content should be. So we center lived experience in everything that we do, and the ethics. Certainly the approaches in the UK are much more open to that and trusting of those approaches.
¿Alguien más?
Is the translator still working?
Yeah.
Okay. Then I have a question. I found this was very inspiring and eye-opening and powerful. And
oh, do you want to do it in Spanish?
Like this? Okay, so I had a question about these virtual tools, the eye tracking, the immersive experiences, and the avatars. Is that like a module that was designed to be exported to different environments? Is it easily adaptable? Do you imagine that that can be a standard part of training, like a mandatory thing that, so imagine, say, the Postal Service or different areas that have nothing to do with this one because health and all policies. Is that what it's designed for?
Yeah, so we're creating a race equity module wraparound. So when we created it, it was during the pandemic, and as you remember, it was, our rapid funding was 18 months that extended to 2 years. All of this was done in that time period, including the quant and the quantitative, the qualitative. So it just gave us that enough to work with to sort of pilot. And so then we went to Welcome. So it's embedded within the Discovery Award to be broadened out in that way. But it needs the debrief model, right? It needs a model of learning around it. But we have to have something that's flexible, because what I envision is, a room like this, because VR, the making of it is still quite expensive, but engaging in it is not. So the price of headsets have gone way down. And we've had a room like this where people have just had the cardboard box with your smartphone, and you're able to engage with the VR in that way. And so what we want is this sort of opportunities for training. So far we've had, teams of like 12, 15, up to 20, but also getting, leaders and policymakers engaged in it as well. Because, because I do quantitative and qualitative work, I present the numbers and they glaze over, and then I present the qualitative narratives, and that's what pulls them in. And so we think the VR takes it to that one, more level of immersion for their, and we know, from the evidence that it is that immersive experience, it's that generation of empathy that that helps to create change.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Si no, me animo yo. Daniela. Aquí.
Igual es mejor que te animes tú, no sé. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la presentación. Mi pregunta se va a salir un poquito de la presentación. Es un poco ideológica, a lo mejor, la respuesta que espero. Pero la reflexión es sobre lo que está pasando en los Estados Unidos en este momento, donde vemos políticas que son resegregacionistas, anti-gay, dicen ellos. Y entonces, claro, estamos pasando de una situación donde teníamos leyes supuestamente neutras, igualitarias, que aún así eran racistas, estructuralmente, institucionalmente, veíamos pautas que producían efectos racistas. Estamos pasando a leyes que son abiertamente racistas, explícitamente racistas, contrarias a la inclusión, la igualdad, la diversidad. Y entonces podría pasar cosas, pues, por ejemplo, como que a la hora de detectar procesos, el National Institute of Health, por ejemplo, no financie proyectos de investigación, etcétera, etcétera. Claro, este marco cambia un poco las estrategias de acción. Ya no es trabajar por hacer visibles procesos, implicar a las personas, etcétera, sino que añade una lucha de poder contra el gobierno, que está promoviendo precisamente lo opuesto a lo que queremos, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, no sé qué se puede responder a esto, pero ¿qué habría que hacer, no? ¿Cómo desde la experiencia, perspectiva, que además es binacional, ¿no? Y ¿qué podría hacerse?
It's a very good question, and one that is not easy for me to answer. These last 3 months have been quite difficult for myself, for my family, colleagues who are working in health, global health in particular, who, things being defunded overnight. I am one generation out of segregation. So I don't see this as any different from, I may not look, I'm 53 years old, right? My parents lived through segregation. Like I see this as part of the process. We, growing up in the South and in Atlanta in particular, has a very strong civil rights culture. And we don't see this as a linear fight, right? So we expect the dips. This one's a dip, but it's not somewhere that we are not familiar with. So while there may have been laws that looked on paper to be one way, I think that they were enacted in very different ways depending on who you were and which part of the country you were in. My career greatly benefited from funding from NIH, particularly the National Institute of Mental Health. I'm still trying to process that those opportunities that created a much more inclusive, group of scientists and researchers and educators is gone. Is virtually, they're chipping away at it. And so it will take some time to recover, but what we have to remember is that just those three things. So Dr. Kamara Jones was a former head of the American Association for Public Health. And when she was the president, she basically named racism as a public health crisis and started to develop this work. So it's not new, it's just that people have to really get focused on these things. And I think that it is about sort of getting, you know, at those very small things like the racism denial, because that's where we're at again. So we've been here before. We just need to, you know, like you said, we need to organize. Like we cannot allow, so whatever we can do, but it can't just be the big things. It's got to be the sort of, what is your day-to-day practice? And how are you working with colleagues, not just the ones that you normally work with, but across sectors, and thinking more about systems and the way that they work rather than I'm just going after this one policy or that. So what is that policy? For us, it's about mapping what that policy is connected to and having a better understanding. And then what is the impact of that policy? Where are the barriers to change? So we like to say, we came up, you know, one day we were just, you know, talking. I think we say we research, you know, inequities in health and health services, but really we research resistance. Like for us, it's about being bold, and this, you know, and I started off by saying I'm hesitant because I've got elderly parents. I need to get back into that country to see them. And so saying this publicly is, you know, we don't know, right? Because the historians and scholars that I work with are, you know, looking at me, shaking their head. You know, I used to look to Professor Sir Simon Wesley, who's a great historian and a psychiatrist, and he used to always tell me I was overreacting about U.S. politics. And this time, he's just like, yeah, no, this is on another level. So I do think we have to take a social justice approach to this and really think about what are the clear steps and what can we do on a day-to-day basis.
Hay dos preguntas desde el público que está online.
Hola, bueno, hay una pregunta de Beatriz Aragón que dice, at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned how you feel every time she has to check the ethnicity race box in the NHS forms and the contradictions of having categories such as Black, African, whatever it is. Can you tell us a little bit more about the usefulness and perils of those registers to visibilize racism? In our context, there is a debate how we should record race and ethnicity categories and what for. Thank you so much for such inspiring work.
Thank you. That's a really important question. And it's something that I also do a lot of work on, is around data quality and its use, not just in research, but within the health service. So the only way that we know where we're at in terms of racial and ethnic inequalities is to collect the information. Right, so in the UK we have about 17, 18 census categories for ethnicity, and they combine race categories, which no system. If you compare around the world, they take different approaches or they make it illegal to capture. I don't think that it's good to avoid capturing that information, because when you use migration and other variables as a proxy, it's not anywhere near getting to the complexities. So, what we're able to do with that level of granularity is to think about intersectionality. So we don't just identify the inequalities and the differences by, say, ethnic category. And a lot of times, to avoid people being identified, we've got to have these aggregate categories. But what we want in that raw data is for there to always to be the options for disaggregation. And that's what these allow you to do. Are they perfect? No, they're not at all. I went from being Black American, African American to being Black other. And everybody who does quantitative analysis knows what happens to the other group, right? And so it's a bit of a, so I also argue to look at the other categories as well. and to do what you can. And the way we do that is by, simple cross-tabbing that against migration status, and then a whole story emerges, right? And it's not just about whether or not you're a migrant or not. It's about, even migration on top of that is very complex. You got step migration, and you've got all, is it number of years you've lived in this country? Is it this, or is it that? And it's just, there's some really interesting, important things that you need to be able to identify by collecting that information. That slide that I showed you from the NHS Race and Health Observatory wouldn't be possible if we didn't collect that information. But what it's told us, for example, most recently, is that those, women from Black and Black racial minoritized groups are 4 to 5 times more likely to die in childbirth, right? Like, that's not, how did we get there? And it's been persistent, and it hasn't moved. So it's only about having that type of granularity that we're able to address some of these issues.
There is another question for you, Stephanie. Daniel dice, ¿hay alguna experiencia o centro sanitario donde la discriminación sea menor? Algo que nos sirve para aprender cómo hacer las cosas mejor de cara a la integración de todo el personal.
So there are some examples. We've got large NHS trusts where we see very low rates of discrimination, racial discrimination. You see better career progression, et cetera. Unfortunately, that's usually down to there being a very charismatic, very intentional leader at the top of the trust, but when that leader moves, the problem, gets worse. And that's why I think this is about really tackling the underlying cultural issues within the organization, and not just relying on, great leadership and holding people to account in that way. But it requires that holding to account at all levels. And I mentioned in my talk, it's not really that top level. It's the first level of managers. So in where it can work and what can be effective is if you have a much better understanding of what's going on at that level, because that's usually the first sign of things going wrong. And really making sure not just, training is great, but it's not the answer, it's the practice that matters the most. So what are people doing in their day-to-day practice? So our patient and carer race equality framework actually brings patients and carers and their families into the conversation. So my colleague likes to call the feedback mechanism like TripAdvisor for the health service, right? Like you get immediate feedback. So what we're working towards is having that be in real time so that it's a part of that monitoring, and then allowing services and clinics to respond in real time.
Vale, pues vamos a parar aquí porque ya vamos con un poco de retraso. No sé si había alguna otra pregunta, si no, bueno, las podemos trasladar en algún otro momento a Stephanie. So, thank you so much.